Karen Rodriguez was driving home one night when armed cartel members forced their way into her truck and kidnapped her. With little help from the authorities, Karen's mom made it her mission to avenge her. This is the story of Miriam Rodriguez. How far would you go for your child? Welcome back to another episode of Killer Bites. I'm your host, Lindsay. The Rodriguez family lived in the city of San Fernando in Mexico. San Fernando is a smaller city of roughly 60,000 people. Though not a very big city, its reputation of violence, kidnappings, and fear far outweighs its size. San Fernando sits along a principal route north through the state of Tamaulipas. A cluster of highways just outside the city lead to a strategic border crossing with the United States. A maze of dirt roads in and around San Fernando make for easy routes for smuggling, ideal for as cartels took over, the violence escalated. In 2010, the bodies of 70 Central American migrants were found by federal authorities. At the time, this was the largest act of violence in the area. The cartel responsible said they suspected that the migrants were going to be recruited to a rival cartel, and so they had to be killed. In 2011, the cartel known as Los Zetas kidnapped hundreds of people through bus hijackings. It's said that the men taken during the hijackings were forced to fight gladiator style to the death, while the women were subjected to horrific. Later that year, mass graves were discovered with nearly 200 bodies, but the actual death toll is estimated to be close to 600. These horrific acts led the people of San Fernando to live in constant fear. Would they or their family members be the next victims of cartel violence? Many bars and restaurants closed permanently due to fear of the cartels, and the city slowly became a shell of itself. At a certain point, the discovery of mass graves became extremely common. As the New York Times puts it, finding fewer than 20 remains barely made headlines. And banks even had a ransom loan due to how often people were kidnapped by cartels, who then demanded ransom money from families. Miriam Rodriguez was born on February 5th, 1960 in San Fernando. She was married and had 3 kids. Her oldest daughter, Azalea, and her youngest, Karen, both lived in San Fernando. Her son, Luis, had moved to Ciudad Victoria to get away from the cartel violence. In San Fernando, Miriam ran a shop that sold cowboy apparel. Her younger daughter, Karen, often helped her mom run the store. Karen was driving her pickup truck home when 2 trucks pulled up on either side of her. Suddenly, armed men were forcing their way into her truck. They took control and drove to Miriam's house, where Karen stayed while Miriam was gone. At the house, they bound and gagged Karen and waited for someone to come home. But the person who came was not who they expected. A family friend was stopping by to work on one of the family's cars. The armed men panicked. They bound and gagged the family friend as well, and then led both him and Karen back to their trucks and left. After learning what happened, the Rodriguezes were desperate to get their daughter back. As was expected, the cartel demanded a ransom. They instructed the Rodriguezes to leave the money near a health clinic and then wait in a cemetery nearby for Karen to be released. The Rodriguezes followed the cartel's instructions, but Karen never appeared. As devastating as it was, Miriam refused to give up hope that their daughter would be returned to them. One day, when someone claiming to be with the cartel called, demanding more money, Miriam simply asked the man if they could meet. To her surprise, the man agreed. Miriam met him at El Junior, a local restaurant. The man insisted that the cartel did not have Karen, but he offered to help get Karen back if she could pay $2,000. Desperate, Miriam agreed. While they sat, somebody came over the man's radio on his hip, calling him by name, Sama. Miriam committed the name to memory. Unfortunately, Sama ghosted after their meeting, but the family kept receiving other calls from people claiming to be with the cartel. The cartel members called demanding more money for Karen's release. Even though it hadn't worked before, the Rodriguezes provided the money, because what if this was the time it did work? The family, but especially Miriam, were willing to do whatever it took to get Karen back. But no matter how much money the family sent, Karen never returned. At some point, Miriam and her husband separated, and Miriam went to live with her daughter Azalea. Miriam tried to go through the proper channels in order to get Karen back, but San Fernando was a city almost entirely run by the cartel. Everyone, including authorities, had ceded control to them, and no one was really willing to help. Miriam slowly began to realize that if she wanted justice for her daughter, she may have to seek it out herself. And so, Miriam decided to take matters into her own hands. Miriam made a vow to track down Karen's kidnappers no matter what. She knew this meant going against the cartel, which was dangerous and could potentially cost her her life, but for Miriam, it was worth it. She began to strategize how she might find out more information on the people responsible for taking her daughter. She thought back to the meeting she had with that cartel member. She remembered the voice coming over the radio, and more importantly, she remembered the name. So she started with him, searching social media for any information she could find. One day while on Facebook, she happened to come across a photo of a young woman and man with someone named Sama tagged. She recognized the man that stood beside the woman. It was the Sama she was looking for. The woman wore the work uniform of an ice cream shop. So that was where Miriam started. The shop that the woman worked at was in Ciudad Victoria, which was 2 hours away from San Fernando. Miriam traveled to Ciudad Victoria. She watched the ice cream shop for weeks, waiting to spot the woman. And finally, she did. Just her luck, Sama was with the woman too. Miriam followed the two back to a house and noted the address. She had found Sama, which was honestly more than the authorities had done so far. But if she wanted Sama arrested, she needed more information. So Miriam disguised herself. She cut her hair and dyed it a shocking red. She donned the uniform of a health ministry employee. In the disguise, Miriam went around interviewing people in the woman's neighborhood until she got the information she needed. She took what she had learned to federal, state, and local authorities, but still everyone turned her away. Fear of the cartels was too great, and even those in a position to help were wary. Not one to give up easily, Miriam persisted, and finally, a federal officer agreed to help her. Later, the officer told the New York Times that Miriam had done an incredible job gathering the information she did. She had a stack of files, details, and information that she had gathered all by herself. He was amazed that Miriam was acting alone, and he stated that helping Miriam was the greatest privilege of his career. Miriam had collected enough evidence, along with the eyewitness account from the family friend, for an arrest warrant. But even with the officer's help, things moved slowly. By the time an arrest warrant was issued, Sama had fled. Meanwhile, in Ciudad Victoria, Louise ran a shop that sold hats and other items. It was Mexico's Independence Day in 2014. The day was coming to a close, and Louise was preparing to close his shop. Just then, a man came up to look at the hats that Louise sold. The man looked familiar to Louise, who studied him closely. It was Sama. Louise contacted his mom, who then contacted authorities. Then, he carefully followed Sama to make sure he didn't get away before the police came and arrested him. Sama was arrested and interrogated by the authorities. During interrogations, Sama easily gave up the names of other cartel members involved in Karen's kidnapping. One of those names was Zapata Gonzalez. At the time, Zapata Gonzalez had only recently turned 18. He became known as the Kid. The police eventually brought Zapata in to interrogate him. During the interrogation, it was clear that Zapata was incredibly nervous. He was described as whiny, asking for his mom and complaining about being hungry. While the officers doing the interrogation ignored his whines, Miriam watched from another room. When she heard Zapata ask for his mom, it struck something in her. To her, Zapata was just a kid. Miriam had packed a lunch for herself that day, but when she heard Zapata, she marched into the interrogation room and gave Zapata her meal. The officers were shocked at what she had done, but the act of generosity and kindness seemed to soften Zapata. They began to get some information out of him, and Zapata finally told them he knew a place where bodies had been discarded, an old abandoned ranch. Zapata led Miriam and the police to the abandoned ranch. The ranch was filled with remnants of gruesome acts. Bullet holes riddled the walls. There were dark stains on the furniture and a dining table, a noose hanging from a tree outside. The place was also filled with human remains. Miriam dug through a pile of personal belongings. Something in the box stopped her cold. It was a scarf, Karen's scarf. And then Miriam found something else too. It was a seat cushion from Karen's truck. As remains from the ranch were examined by forensic analysts, Miriam was told that Karen was not among the bodies identified. But Miriam wouldn't take no for an answer. She continued to fight federal officials to further examine the remains. And it turns out she was right to do so. In 2015, a year after that trip to the ranch, forensic analysts identified a femur bone that belonged to Karen. Because of Miriam's persistence, she and her family were able to lay Karen to rest. But back to that fateful day on the ranch. On the way back, they passed a restaurant. Miriam and Azalea had eaten at the restaurant a few days after Karen was kidnapped. When Miriam saw the restaurant, it triggered a memory of that day. Miriam and Azalea ran into a woman by the name of Elvia Ulisa. Miriam had known Elvia since she was a kid, when her mother abandoned her at a local brothel. As Elvia grew up, Miriam always did what she could to watch out for her. Miriam often gave her Karen's old clothes when Karen grew out of them. The day Miriam and Azalea saw Elvia at the restaurant, they obviously mentioned what happened to Karen. And Elvia had acted very strangely, playing dumb as if she was hearing the news for the first time. This didn't sit right with Miriam because everyone had been talking about the kidnapping. What if Elvia knew something about Karen's kidnapping? Even worse, what if she was involved? Maybe that's why she was playing dumb. The thought enraged Miriam. This was a major betrayal. Based off her gut feeling, Miriam got to work trying to find any information she could on Elvia. Miriam discovered that Elvia was dating one of the men that kidnapped Karen. The man was in prison at that point for unrelated crimes. With this information, Miriam began scoping out the prison where the man was held. She knew that Elvia would show up eventually, and she would be ready. Elvia did make an appearance, and Miriam passed along her information to the police. And just like that, Elvia was arrested. Through interrogations, Elvia admitted that some of the ransom calls had even been made from her house. After Elvia, Miriam set her sights on another man by the name of Enrique Joel Rubio Flores. Many involved in the cartel tried to start new lives. They became taxi drivers, shop owners, or, in the case of Enrique, born-again Christians. They wanted to live normal lives, even though they enacted unspeakable violence on others. Enrique had done just that, and probably thought he would never have to answer for his crimes. Miriam went to the small town of Aldama to visit Enrique's grandmother. His grandmother told Miriam that Enrique was a born-again Christian now and living a different life. Miriam was able to get the name of the church he attended. As determined as ever, Miriam began attending services every Sunday, waiting for Enrique to appear. As expected, he eventually did. His arrest was a dramatic scene. Officials came to arrest him in the chapel in the middle of a church service. Miriam watched as another person involved in Karen's kidnapping was brought down. The congregants of the church looked on, shocked and horrified. Some of them even begged the officers and Miriam to have mercy on Enrique. To hear Miriam's family tell it, Miriam responded, "Where was his compassion when they killed my daughter?" After Enrique, Miriam set her sights on a man who had since become a florist. By this point, Miriam had been hunting down cartel members for a few years. She had founded a group called the Vanished Collective. The group was meant for parents or family members of loved ones kidnapped by the cartel. Because of this, Miriam had gained some notoriety. So when Miriam found the florist, he recognized her and he ran. This didn't curtail Miriam, however. Miriam chased after the man, managing to pin him down. She held him at gunpoint until the police came and arrested him. Over the course of 3 years, Miriam single-handedly tracked down almost all 10 living cartel members involved in Karen's kidnapping and murder. In a city where people, so terrorized by the cartels, had all but given up, her quest for justice gave people hope, but fighting back came at a cost. In March of 2017, several prisoners escaped from a penitentiary in Ciudad Victoria through a tunnel that led out of the prison. This was the prison where many of the cartel members Miriam helped put away were held. One of the prisoners that escaped was Enrique Joel Rubio Flores. Worrying that she could be in danger, Miriam requested protection from the government. Due to her request, the police set up period patrols of her home and workplace. Even with the increased danger, Miriam continued her work. She tracked down a woman involved in the kidnapping to Ciudad Victoria, where she now worked as a live-in nanny. Miriam watched the family's house for weeks, waiting for the woman to make an appearance. She lived out of her car, even urinating in cups. But finally, the woman appeared. Miriam notified the authorities to have her arrested. When the police came to arrest her, Miriam tripped and fell running up to them and fractured her foot. Miriam was still on crutches the night of Mother's Day in San Fernando. She arrived home late, around 10:30 p.m., Miriam wasn't aware of the car pulling up behind her in the street, which held some of the prisoners that had escaped a couple months before. They fired 13 rounds from the car and then sped off. Miriam was rushed to the hospital, but sadly, she died on the way there. Miriam's assassination drew collective outrage, not only in San Fernando, but around the world. Many saw Miriam and her mission as a beacon of hope. In some ways, she may have even been seen as invincible or superhuman. This was understandable. A mother in her mid-50s who tracked down cartel members for 3 years, that is superhuman behavior. But Miriam was not superhuman or invincible. Even in death, Miriam was still able to continue her quest for justice. Thanks to a previous tip from Miriam, another woman linked to Karen's kidnapping was arrested shortly after Miriam was killed. Miriam's legacy lives on. In the central square of San Fernando, a plaque was unveiled in her honor. It reads, "I learned that courage is not the absence of fear, but the triumph over it. The brave man is not the one who feels fear, but the one who conquers it." And Luis, her son, became head of the Vanished Collective. Luis kept the group going for a while, but even though he respected the work his mother had done, he didn't want to be consumed by it like Miriam was. The Vanished Collective slowly dissipated. This was partially due to Luis pulling back from the group, but a lot of the members also became wary after Miriam was killed. Her death brought the reality of fighting the cartel into focus. Although they all wanted justice for their loved ones, many didn't want their lives to end the way Miriam's did. As of 2020, only 2 men involved in Miriam's murder had been arrested. The first was Alfredo Misael, who was arrested on May 14th, 2017. He was the owner of the vehicle used and told authorities he was hired to transport prisoners who had escaped. He identified some of the other people involved with nicknames: El Diablo, El Aluche, and El Flaco. El Diablo, whose real name was Eric Leonel, was arrested on June 17th, 2017. Alfredo Misael was sentenced to 15 years, and Eric Leonel was sentenced to 10 years. Other alleged culprits have either refused to testify, are in prison for other crimes, or were killed when the arrest warrant was issued. Louise and the rest of Miriam's family were not happy with the sentences handed down. Louise called them ridiculous sentences. He worried about what would happen once they were released. Would they be looking for revenge? For some time after Miriam's death, things slowed down. The people of San Fernando were exhausted by so many years of tragedy. They craved a sense of normalcy over anything. That was until the killing of Luciano Leal Garza in 2020. Luciano was 14 years old, kidnapped from the streets by cartel members. His kidnapping woke people back up. There were marches for Luciano demanding justice. Hundreds searched miles of land for him while his mother, Annabel Garza, became a spokesperson for missing people in Mexico. Miriam's son, Luis, noticed the parallels between his family's story and the Luciano story. And Miriam's legacy was a blueprint of how to fight back against the cartel, but people also knew how the story ended. Because of this, the Garzas were less interested in punishing the cartel and solely focused on getting back their son. Luciano's body was found in October of 2020. On the day of Luciano's funeral, a crowd of hundreds of people led a procession through the streets. They moved slowly, allowing everyone to see what the cartel had done. Perhaps this was Miriam's impact. Instead of looking away, as the townspeople had grown accustomed to doing, they faced the cruelty. They honored those, like Luciano, who had been taken so violently from the world. Louise and Azalea both attended Luciano's burial service. Afterwards, they walked over to where their mother and sister were buried, only 100 feet away. They found peace in the fact that Miriam and Karen were laid to rest side by side. Unfortunately, no one has really taken up the mantle that Miriam left behind. Since Miriam's death in 2017, violence continues to escalate. In the summer of 2020, 117 murders were reported within a 24-hour period. With little help from the government and no one like Miriam taking matters into their own hands, family members have almost no hope of finding their loved ones or receiving justice. Miriam Rodriguez was just a woman in her 50s, like any other. She had no formal training, no experience in law enforcement, but her love for her daughter led her to do what so many, including the government, had become too fearful to do. She fought back against the cartel. Because of her, nearly a dozen cartel members were taken off the streets and put behind bars. Miriam Rodriguez will long be remembered for her strength resourcefulness, and perseverance, but most importantly, for the love she had for her child, a force like no other. Thanks for watching Killer Bites. I'm your host, Lindsay. See you next time.